Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
The Negro and were content to leave his destiny in the hands of southern states. Today, the white backlash feels not one but two presidential candidates. Then as now, some former friends, disillusioned by urban violence or preoccupied with other issues, have edged away from the black man's cause. And again, there are demands for a reduction of federal responsibility and an insistence on various and subtle forms of local control. In 1876, the electoral process broke down and the Southern Bourbons emerged to dictate the infamous Compromise of 1877, which paved the way for a new era of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and brutality. Today, a third-party candidate has publicly stated his intention of following the same strategy, and no man with eyes that can see can doubt the consequences should the Wallace strategy succeed. There is, however, one profound difference between 1876 and 1968. In 1876, the forces of reaction could impose their will on black Americans. We were not yet one generation removed from slavery. We were concentrated in the South. We were corralled on plantations. We were powerless and dependent. Today, thanks to the Civil Rights Revolution, we have come too far to be so easily turned around. We have gained access to and influence in institutions hitherto closed to us. We have accumulated political power in many urban centers, and we have produced a new generation of young black people possessed of the spirit and determination to be free. They can never again be suppressed. Thus, the victory of racism and reaction at the polls in 1968 would not bring peace and tranquility to our nation. It would bring frustration and chaos. It would not bring law and order. It would bring intensified resistance, and I fear an escalation of violence. This is a prescription for national tragedy. Faced with such a prospect, I believe political neutrality is not an option for men of goodwill in 1968. It is certainly not an option for black Americans. Those who urge black Americans to go fishing on election day are merely exercising their demagogic faculties at the expense of our hard-won struggle, including the deaths of many noble citizens, black and white, for the right to vote, and in the process they are aiding and abetting the reemergence of white supremacy. I am confident that this defeatist advice will be overwhelmingly rejected by black Americans. We have sacrificed much too long to allow ourselves to be led down the blind alley of dead-end politics. I therefore urge all black men and women of voting age to register now and to vote in November. I urge young people below the voting age to become active in educating their elders to the basic issues involved in the campaign. I believe that in 1968, we have something else that we did not have in 1876, a candidate who is equal to the great challenges facing America. He is a candidate around whom the Negro people can rally with enthusiasm, for he has been a champion of racial equality for many years. He was in the forefront of the civil rights fight, when that fight was still a lonely, unpopular, isolated struggle. He is a candidate around whom working people can rally with enthusiasm, for he has been a friend of labor in its most difficult hours. He is a candidate who understands that the fate of the black people, the vast majority of whom are workers, is inextricably tied to the fate of the labor movement. He has understood, certainly better than any other candidate, that economic justice elimination of poverty. The welfare of a nation depends upon a free, fully open, strong, and growing trade union movement. He is a candidate around whom all Americans who yearn for a world of peace can rally with enthusiasm, for he was working for peace and disarmament long before these became popular slogans. And he has understood that real peace depends upon the strengthening of democratic institutions throughout the world and the development of international peacekeeping machinery. Finally, he is a man whom I have known and admired for many years, and with whom I have worked in many facets of the fight for human dignity. Of his dedication to this fight, I have an intimate appreciation and profound respect. I therefore, with great satisfaction, endorse and vigorously recommend the candidacy of Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey.
Randolph, can you just say very briefly in your own words why you think this year is so important that you come out and support a candidate when you've only done this once before?
Well, I stated that in this.
I think he wants you to say it because he wants it briefly for the television, just the background.
Well, one basic reason is that if George Wallace receives 20% of the vote, it is likely to result in the election being thrown in the House of Representatives, inasmuch as a majority for neither candidates will come about in the Electoral College. In that event, each state has only one vote, and hence Wallace would be able to make deals with both the Republican and Democratic parties in the interest of breaking down the civil rights legislation and preventing future civil rights legislation from being enacted in the Congress. It is for this reason that I'm greatly concerned about this election, because if a deal can be made with either party, and no doubt principally the Republican Party, why the hope of the Negro for the consolidation of his civil rights status will become grim and doubtful.
Mr. Randolph, if George Wallace were not in this race, or if he were not a threat, would you be endorsing either Hubert Humphrey or former Vice President Nixon?
Yes, I would be endorsing Hubert Humphrey because of his long record in the interest of civil rights. Hubert Humphrey was responsible for driving Strom Thurmond out of the Democratic Party convention in 1948. And Thurmond went out and built up the States' Rights Party, which was designed, of course, to block the progress of civil rights legislation. So Humphrey does not come to this struggle as a Johnny-come-lately. He has a long record, and a commendable one. Personally, I have never participated in political presidential campaigns before the campaign of President Johnson. I've always been participating in the socialist campaigns. And, of course, I felt that the basic social, economic, and political changes that not only Negroes but white workers needed would not come through either one of the parties unless you had an extraordinarily strong man committed.
Mr. Humphrey is the only candidate still in the running who can do something, will try to do something.
I think he is.
You say that many people almost has a tendency of kind of discount George Wallace in this campaign. Now, you seem to be saying you think he's a very serious threat now to the steps that have been made by black people.
I think he is because he has made disorders in the streets as the major issue. And there is widespread sentiment throughout the country, especially among the middle classes and so forth, about what is to be done and what can be done to eliminate disorders in the streets. And they never link the question of disorders in the streets as being the effect of a basic social cause, namely racial and social injustice.
Is Mr. Wallace, Mr. Nixon, or both you're speaking of?
I'm speaking of both, yes. Everybody wants law and order, but you had law and order under slavery. So that the reason for disorders is a lack of racial and social justice. Now, when you fight for law and order, you ought to fight for racial and social justice first, because then you will be dealing basically with the cause and effect.
Do you believe Mr. Humphrey is taking this particular approach to law and order properly in his campaign right now?
Well, I have been tied up with our own convention, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. That has taken up most of my time, and I haven't read all of the speeches that Hubert Humphrey has made, but Vice President Humphrey is a student of social problems, and he is conversant with the economic forces, and he knows that they're related to political power, and hence I have the utmost confidence in the integrity of his vision and his position. In other words, he is not going to play politics with the question of racial and social justice and law and order. He is going to deal with it frankly and honestly. And therefore, I have the utmost respect for his attitude and mind and his history on this question.
Mr. Randolph, your freedom budget has been pretty well blocked in Washington. How do you evaluate President Johnson's administration in terms of what you wanted and what really?
As I indicated in my statement,
It's 6 cuts.
I only departed from my usual policy of not supporting presidential candidates during the Johnson
over periods of time without any substantial
ran for president.
effort being made on the other part of the other
I
side
took that position
to
because of the
reciprocate and to
threat
show good faith.
of world
Should be
waterism.
evidence enough to us that
And
it's simply a
world
matter of
waterism
negotiating technique of doing nothing while you have
another
to
word
do
for
everything.
reaction.
220 Houston. Richard
This is
Nixon
the
supports
reason
space program. Mark.
I took that position,
have
and
been a
I think
long-time supporter
that it was
in the
justified.
Eisenhower
Because
administration, you may remember, I
President
was one of those
Johnson
within the administration
supported
that debated during
the civil rights
1967 and strongly advocated that we go forward with the
proposals
program.
before the Congress.
I believe that at this time what we need
vigorously,
is to continue to go forward with the program on a steady basis, not a feast and famine
The
basis.
civil rights
I think
revolution, from the point of view
330
legislation,
Washington, Senator Huyen Van Cao,
in
Chairman
my
of Foreign
opinion,
Relations
has been a
Information Committee of
success.
South Vietnamese government, Hanoi won't
But
talk
the
to
civil
us.
rights
Mark.
revolution is not the solution of the economic and social problems
talking
that
to
confront the
the
nation.
enemy. But until today,
Therefore,
Hanoi refused to
We have
talk
come to
us.
the stage
And as
when
you
a
say,
social revolution
look at this
must be
delegation,
developed.
and you will find
In
the
the interest of
legitimacy
economic,
of the government of
political,
South
and
Vietnam.
social progress,
We are
not only for
bringing
Negroes,
more than 4
but for
million
the
votes.
white pool as
And we
well.
really represent
Because
the people of
Negroes
South
can't
Vietnam.
win and
We
can't
were
achieve
elected
the
by
social
the people
revolution
of South
alone.
Vietnam. But even so, Hanoi
They
refused to
need
talk
the
to
help
us.
of the poor, and the poor, the white poor, are in larger numbers than the black poor. Moreover,
has no agricultural program.
Negroes
never had an
can't win a social revolution without the support of organized labor.
Ezra Taft Benson.
And organized labor did support
resulted in the buildup of
the
enormous
civil rights revolution.
climbing government costs,
And
falling farm income.
it, together with the
535
NAACP,
Washington,
the
Agency
National
Secretary Robert
Association for the
Weaver, Model City,
Advancement of
Mark.
Colored People, represented
do in a
the
brand new
driving
community.
force
That's very difficult to do when
for
you're
civil
talking
rights
of
legislation.
going over or revitalizing one that exists and pretty well structured. And I hope that there will be excitement and that there will be new ideas and new approaches here.
635 Mississippi, Charles Evers, Democratic National Committeeman from Mississippi. Vote, Mark. We've been fighting for freedom, Mississippi, for
Well, no, not a greater
for
freedom
everyone.
than Marigold Water,
rich,
because
poor,
Marigold
not only
Water
Mississippi,
had the
but all over
forces
the
of
country.
reaction with him, the
battle
John Birch
this year
Society,
is being fought in the election
the
campaign.
Ku Klux
Our
Klan,
allies, Hubert
and he
Humphrey,
himself
and his
was not an ordinary
Together
man
we can win this battle.
when it
Together,
came
if we
to
rest and hope.
reaching
My
the
brother
people.
was killed fighting for the right.
He had
Dr. Martin
force,
Luther King and my friend Bob
and
Kennedy
consequently
both died fighting for the
he
same
was a
battle.
person you couldn't
We've
underrate.
got to carry on that
Now,
fight.
Wallace is a rabble-rouser, but he has no depth. And I think, however, the great threat that he holds to the civil rights movement and also social and economic democracy is that he may be able to throw this election into the House of Representatives, such as occurred during the Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden election in 1876. Now, when the election was thrown into the House in 1876, what resulted? The Army was withdrawn from the South, the Federal Army. And this was a commitment that Rutherford B. Hayes made. If the votes from Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon were shunted off over into his column. And as a result of that, the black freedmen were exposed to the oppression and the ferocity and the barbarism of the old slave masters. And this meant that the Reconstruction Revolution collapsed. And there resulted in the years following a rash of legislation in all of the southern states, such as grandfather clauses, white primaries, poll tax legislation, denying the Negro the right to vote, reducing his citizenship to that of a serfdom. And this, of course, can't happen today, but a great blow can be struck for the cause of stateism, state rightsism by Wallace. And he's reaching a large segment of the American people. You can't underrate him, because he's preaching a doctrine that the people feel will react against the Negro. Because when they speak of disorders in the streets, they're really talking about Negroes. They're really trying to show that Negroes are creating all of the rioting and that they are responsible for the disorders. Now, labor, also had a struggle trying to win its rights, but they didn't label labor with being responsible for disorders in the streets. And yet, in 1877, labor tore up the railroad tracks, burned down terminal stations, and so forth. But they're trying to label the Negro with the responsibility for disorders in the streets, and sort of free everybody else from any responsibility whatsoever for these disorders. But basically, the disorders in the streets are the result of the fact that the ghettos represent kegs of social dynamism.
Earlier that the Negro being automatically a member of the lower class and the white labor movement had to work together. Now, does Mr. Wallace's appeal to what you think of as your natural allies in the labor movement, the or are you?
Yes, because you have workers in some of the suburban areas, workers whose wages are relatively high and have risen to the level of middle class. And they have all of the prejudices and so-called injustice complexes that some of the people have in the rural South. Therefore, perhaps a number of the trade union people will vote for Wallace. I believe some of them will. And during this campaign in Chicago, when they were trying to break into Cicero and win open occupancy housing, why Paul Douglas was defeated because of increasing the escalation of the white backlash as a result of the struggle of the Negro to win their rights to open occupancy in housing. It was a great blow to liberal sentiment in the country, because Paul H. Douglas was one of the giants in American liberal history. And it was a great loss not only to Negroes, but to white workers and the cause of freedom and democracy in our country. I knew Paul Douglas very well. We worked together on many issues and so forth in Chicago and other places. And we don't have in the country a man with a more full-fledged sense of dedication to human dignity than Paul H. Douglas. And he is, I think that Humphrey is of the same school, same spirit, the same dedication and devotion to social idealism.
Mr. Weston,
Yes.
do you basically agree with Mr. Randolph?
I agree with Mr. Randolph's release in almost every detail. I, as you know, am a pacifist, and I would hope that Mr. Humphrey will, as the campaign proceeds, take a more vigorous position in regard to ending the war in Vietnam, but I don't believe that Mr. Nixon will do as well in ending it. And they are the choices which we have before us. But I enthusiastically endorse Mr. Humphrey along with Mr. Randolph. I'd like to answer Murray Kempton's question in my own terms regarding the freedom budget. Given the fact that the Johnson administration did not see fit to vigorously press for the kind of legislation which the freedom budget proposed, and which I believe is the only answer to the problem, I believe that if Mr. Nixon goes in, he will take into the House and the Senate reactionaries who are not at all dedicated to such a proposition, but who, on the other hand, are using the term black capitalism as an obscuration from facing up to the freedom budget. I believe that if Mr. Humphrey goes in, he will take into the House and Senate men who at least will be given to considering it if we can build up the kind of pressure we ought to build up for it.
May I add, too, that I'm not a pacifist, but I've always opposed war. I opposed the First World War and went to jail on account of it. I opposed the First World War on the grounds that it was an imperialistic war, number one, and that the slogan of making the world safe for democracy was pure hypocrisy. And that, and I went around the country preaching that doctrine. And Eugene V. Debs was arrested in Cleveland after he addressed a great mass meeting in one of a circle of squares there. I followed the following week and made the same kind of speech, and they arrested me too. And So that I've always opposed wars, but I didn't oppose the Second World War because it had overtones of racism and overtones of anti-Semitism. And of course, I'm opposed to racism and anti-Semitism. And this is one of the reasons why I supported the Second World War. Now, I don't believe that our country can be the policeman of the world. And the reason why I didn't enter the marches and so forth for peace was because I felt that the people who were in the peace movement had left the civil rights movement. And I felt that the civil rights movement would suffer if everybody left it. And consequently, I believe that you couldn't fight on two fronts at the same time. That is why I didn't get out and join the marches for peace. But I believe in peace as much as anybody who marched for peace, for that matter.
Does that belief shake your faith in Humphrey?
No, it doesn't, because I think candidate Humphrey is basically committed to peace. And there is no doubt in my mind about that. But, of course, he was a president, vice president, and he couldn't come out and take a position that was in violation of the policy of the Johnson administration. And it must also be understood that the Johnson administration inherited the war. They inherited the war. President Kennedy had it, and he got it from Eisenhower. So that these are some of the facts that history, in a period of relative calm, will be able to evaluate with some perspicacity and force and logic. And so I don't feel, as a matter of fact, that I did a disservice to the cause of peace by not going out into the streets and marching for peace, because I didn't want the Alabama-Mississippi front to be left naked and open to the forces of Southern racism, and that was happening.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yes.